Hello, and welcome to the Grouping and Mapping course, Chapter 2, Lesson 1. During this lesson, we'll explain the concepts of mapping and grouping. But before we can do that, let's build the code for our sample application. This is so you can follow along during this lesson. And here is that code. A link to this repository will be included in the description of this lesson. Start with the README. It has all the instructions that you need to get started. You can also create a clone of the sample I model we use by following the link in the description and selecting the Coffs Harbour I model. And here is the results of those instructions. Notice that unlike in the previous lessons, the grouping and mapping widget is empty. Those mappings we were using haven't been created yet. In this chapter, we'll go through creating those mappings together. Our first step to filling in the mappings, our data views, will be our procurement manager Paul's bill of materials. Paul needs to know the number of architectural installations going to the project, specifically doors and windows. This bill of materials will break them down by grouping matching properties. The grouping and mapping widget will help us create this view. Once the report is created, we'll then view the data in a table to understand the results. And finally, we will move that data into Paul's specialized procurement widget to view the bill of materials. Now we know what our end goal is. Let's take a moment to talk about the steps we'll take to get there. Our engineers' reports are all created the same way. First, we need to create a mapping. Then we extract the data using that mapping. Then the final step is presenting that data. Because extracting the data and presenting the data happen within the application at a code level, we'll talk about that later in the course. For now, we're going to be focusing on creating that mapping. And what is that mapping supposed to look like? Mapping is both the act of defining our view and the container of it. What our mappings contain is a hierarchy of groups, each with their own properties. To get started at mapping, we must first make a mapping. The mapping we will create will be called architectural installations. This is because that is the view that Paul needs for his report. This mapping will have two different children, the windows group and the doors group. And those groups will have their own children, sharing properties of height and width, but for the purpose of this video, we're just going to be focusing on creating the mapping and its groups. So let's jump into the application and see how it's done. To get started creating our mappings, we'll use the new button up here in the top left corner of the grouping and mapping widget. We'll name this new group Architectural Installations as we just discussed, and we'll hit save. We'll click on the name of our mapping in order to move into its metadata, the groups. Next, we'll create those groups. It's these groups that will filter our data down to just the relevant elements. How does it know what's relevant? With an EC-SQL query. Don't worry. While writing your own is an option, the widget will create one for us. By hitting the add button up here, we can see three different options. The manual one is, as you might guess, the option to write your own query. But the easiest option to have one generated for us will be the query keyword here. We'll click on that option, and we can see the three different options again mirrored inside of this dialog. But we'll get started creating our mapping. We'll start with our Windows group. And we'll scroll down to where we get to add our keyword. And the keyword we will add is window. By hitting apply, we'll see those highlighted in the viewer itself. And after a quick visual confirmation, we will hit save. And we have one group finished. Next, we'll start on our doors group, following the same flow. And we see the doors highlighted in our viewer, but we have one issue. This right here is not a door. Unfortunately, there are times when extraneous data makes its way into our groups. Later in the course, we will learn about refining our groups, pulling this extraneous data out. But the queries generated by our grouping and mapping widget will work as a good base for us to get started. So we'll go ahead and hit save. With our two different groups created, we can see them clearly by toggling on the colors. We can see the doors in yellow and our windows in blue. Now, you might be wondering, what kind of query was generated to create these groups? Well, if we look at our Windows group and look at this eye icon in the top right, we can actually see the query that was created. It's simply looking for our keyword, window, and things like code values, user labels, and the like. The query works this way to function more generically. This way we can reuse this group on any similar created model. Because of this, grouping and mapping doesn't just organize the data of a single project, but can continue into the future. And with that, we've accomplished the goal of this video: to use the grouping and mapping widget to create our mapping and our groups for our procurement manager Paul's bill of materials. In the next video, we will finish the create mapping step by adding the properties to our group. We'll then take the next steps to extract that data and present it in our procurement report. I'll see you then.